As the title of the session indicates, we're going to talk about reframing the narrative of legal education. And as Corley indicated, also, for those who haven't had that opportunity, you're going to be on YouTube as well. So that's another prize and opportunity for getting up early, and thank you for being here. As we all know, the law schools have been in the news a great deal recently, and not all of it has really been positive news. We've certainly seen an unprecedented decline in numbers attending law school and number of applicants. Many are concerned about declining job opportunities for some of our students. And of course, the papers always say that law school costs too much, there's too much debt. So others say that law school is also too long, it should be 2 years as opposed to 3 years. I could go on, but all of the discussion really has led to a lot more scrutiny of the law schools than we've had in the past. And as a consequence, those are issues that we are called upon to address, and particularly you. Most of you as development officers have to address them as well. As the university president, I certainly wondered about how law schools are going to navigate all of these issues and how we were going to be able to move forward. I looked at this very, very closely, and particularly to try to figure out how can we come up with effective counterpoints to a lot of the negative publicity that we have out there about law schools. Now, I know that oftentimes development officers feel that they're on their own, that they have to answer these questions kind of on the fly by themselves. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm so delighted that today we've been able to bring together a group of truly outstanding folks who have grappled with all of these issues, have in fact been on the front lines and have addressed these questions. So it is really a very special and unique opportunity for all of you to have a chance to hear what the folks who've really been top decision makers have to say about these issues. It's truly an outstanding panel. We have Paulette Brown, the president of the American Bar Association. She's here with us. She's a partner at Locke and Lord, and so we're delighted to have you with us, Paulette. Thank you for being here. We have Blake Morant, who just about 20 seconds ago finished his term as president of the Association of American Law Schools, and of course has been involved in law school work for many years. I remember meeting him 20 years ago when he was a professor at Toledo and I was dean of the law school at Ohio State. And he was introduced to me as someone who was really going places. And I certainly agreed with it at that time. And now he is the dean of my alma mater, the George Washington University. And we have another old friend of mine. That didn't happen this way. We wanted to get the best, but they happen to be friends of mine, and I'm very pleased about that. Rick Matasar. Rick and I started out at the University of Iowa many years ago. In fact, we used to play basketball together. And Rick has, of course, been dean of University of Florida, Chicago, Kent, New York Law School, and served for the last couple of years as an assistant to the president at NYU and is now at Tulane University. So we're really pleased that he was able to come up from New Orleans today and to try to get a little more rain and be here with us. So we really have a great panel, and I'm delighted that they're here with us. What I'd like to do is maybe start off the discussion. Each of the panelists, I would ask them kind of, what do you think we can do to help develop a more balanced perception of law schools among all the stakeholders that are out there that we have to be able to respond to and try to answer their questions. So let's kind of start off with that. And I'm not going to stand here. I'll take a seat, and then we'll continue the questions. So, Blake, you want to start?
I'd love to. First of all, I want to thank Greg for that wonderful introduction. And can everyone hear me? Okay, very good. It's early in the morning, and there's food in the back. Many of my colleagues at GW have heard this story before. My grandfather was a minister for 68 years. And the one thing he told me was, if there's food in the room, your speech better be short. So I'm going to keep that in mind as we sort of do this. I want to thank Greg for that wonderful introduction and for doing this panel. He has been underscored as truly one of the visionaries, not only in legal education, but higher education as well. And he's been a mentor to me and everything like this, and it's great to have you on board. And we're going to call him frequently. He thinks he's not on the tap, but he really is. Let me start with a little narrative, and I'm just so pleased to be here with Paulette and Greg, who are also true visionaries and have thought about this very deeply, and having academics as well as someone from the bench of bar, as Paulette is, I think really captures some of my introductory comments. So let me say this. As many of you know, the AALS has been an organization that has focused itself on being more of a resource for member schools and also being a voice for American legal education. And so during the year of my presidency, I've taken a lot to really talk to the media and other concerns about legal education, its value, and what have you. And here's some of the things that have come about as a result of this that answers this initial question. We are dealing with a situation that almost seems like a perfect storm. And here are the ingredients. So one of the ingredients of the perfect storm that I've had to address has been the overall perception of lawyers. And we all know, you've probably heard all the lawyer jokes and everything like this. I think for many years, we were cavalier about that. Many people were still coming to law school and everything. But it really has had a palpable effect on individuals as a sort of foundational element that we have to rebut in terms of the value proposition of going to law schools. And oftentimes when I've spoken, I've given the narrative about how it's become part of popular culture to rail against lawyers. I'm sure many of you have seen the movie Jurassic Park, the original one, which is the best, by the way, but I digress. And if you remember, in the very first scene when the T-Rex is chasing this Jeep of people, and there are 4 people in there, and one of them is a lawyer. And the first person to get devoured by the T-Rex is the lawyer. And I'll never forget this. I was in the theater when I was seeing this. And when the lawyer got gobbled up, the whole theater erupted in applause. And that sort of told me, basically speaking, there's this overarching trope out there about lawyers and their values. So that's one. The second thing is, when we had the Great Recession in 2008, it sort of stripped away a lot of the veneer of the problems that we've had with legal education, both in terms of cost, and then jobs went away. And then the third has to do with the media. And as I have said so many times, folks love to rail against lawyers, and for some reason, the media has loved to really focus in on legal education. I have oftentimes at my dean's meetings said, I want to find out which one of you either A, rejected the head of the editorial board of the New York Times from your law school, or B, you accepted him and gave him a bad grade, or C, and somehow you rejected him in coming and speaking at your graduation. One of those 3 has led to some kind of antipathy toward it. But be that as it may, we have a media that really focuses in on all of the issues that we have, and that's been in the public consciousness. So how do we deal with that, and how should we think about this in terms of how we move forward to create a counter-narrative? And I think we should be honest about a couple of things. First of all, certainly we have issues. Costs are an issue. Debt is an issue. Certainly is an issue. Jobs is somewhat of an issue, and Paulette and I were talking about that, and she's going to talk about it more than I. Jobs have been an issue, but that's a very interesting question to really talk about in terms of what types of jobs that are really out there for our students to have. And I will say this, and I want to stop so my other panelists can deal with this. As we look at those issues, they are issues that are throughout higher education. So one of the things that I've talked about, and particularly when I had an interview with the Chronicle of Higher Education, is that when you talk about outcomes, which is what jobs basically pertain to, when you talk about value, whether or not this is an educational milieu that really gives people the tools that they need in order to succeed in life. And I truly do believe that about legal education, given the fact that we're sending people out to a global market, and they're going to have a career that's going to arc for a number of different years. They're going to get skill sets that really optimize their ability to be able to do that. And then the other part has to do with debt. the whole idea that students now have more debt than they ever have had before, and that is a problem. And there's no question about that, but that is throughout higher education. So I am glad that we're now beginning to have this conversation with other stakeholders in higher ed to really deal with that. So I'm going to stop there and the other panelists chime in.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for braving the weather, although I'm happy that it's rain rather than snow. It's really an honor to be on this panel with these esteemed gentlemen. But you know, when I think about what can be done to help the public have a more balanced view, I think about, in some ways, self-help. I think that a lot of times lawyers and other legal professionals allow others to frame the issue for us. And I think that one of the things that helps us to allow that to happen is that sometimes we don't know enough about ourselves and all the good that we are doing to be able to counter some of the things that are being said. And so there are so many things, for example, on your website that are extremely informative that you and all of us, can't hear me? That no one's ever accused me of that before. That we can frame our own conversation this way. And so one of the things that I do as I travel around, I try to meet with the editorial board of whatever city I'm going to. And I will begin the conversation. I will frame the conversation. I will take control over the conversation so that I know that the story of lawyers in America is going to be told in the way that I want it to be told. And, you know, the other thing, President, you were talking about rebutting certain negative things. Sometimes I think we have to go beyond rebutting, and that goes again to telling our own story and introducing our own story. And one of the things I've learned is when people start talking about something that's not in the most positive light, we don't repeat it. We don't continue that conversation. We change the conversation to a more positive tone. So in other words, people say that, you know, the law students are not as employable. We don't repeat that. No, we don't even say, no, that's not true that law students are not employable. We just go into a dialogue to discuss what we are doing in law schools to enhance the visibility and viability of law students and lawyers without ever repeating the negative comment. I think that if we start practicing that, then people will have a better understanding of all of the good things that we do. And I know I'm making it sound sort of simplistic, and it's not that easy, but with practice, you can do that. So when people question you about areas and they start it in a tone of negativeness, I think that it's incumbent upon us to just really listen before we start to talk, and then rather than repeat what they say or even include in our answer anything that they've said, we start talking about all of the good things. We talk about the incubators that are being formed within law schools. We talk about how we're getting lawyers more practice ready, how we're going more from clinical programs to things that are more relevant. And we talk about how law students and young lawyers are very interested in pro bono work. And when we talk about that, we talk about how lawyers provide more pro bono work than any other profession. And how we demonstrate it on a daily basis, and we cite to cases as to where young lawyers and other lawyers have helped society advance, and they could not be able to do this but for lawyers. And we keep it always in a positive tone and never say anything negative. So, you know, that's my general idea of some of what it is that we can do, and we just have to be intentional and very conscious about it and listen to what other people are saying and, and reframe the discussion.
I'll add my thanks to Greg and everyone's distinguished. We got it. Okay. Question was about balance. Okay, so balancing what against what? On one hand, you have arrayed the forces of evil. You know, people who see that the best narrative to tell is a negative narrative and then try to outdo each other in finding the most negative thing they can say because A, it sells, it's easier to write, and you don't have to be very careful in the things you say because you throw enough stuff against the wall, it sticks. That plays directly into the social narratives that are told by a society that when you look at anything in social media ends up tending to run toward the negative. So we have aligned on one side what is the common current way of discourse. Walk into the Congress, hear a positive story there. Do we hear a positive story about city government? Do we hear a positive story to be told about the police? Do we have a positive story to be told about anything? Okay, so the core communication device is that which is negative, and that can be done quickly. Second, all schools are not created equal. So if we ask the question of how do the law schools balance against the narrative told by others, law schools are not aligned. All law schools could have common DNA, but they tend to see each other instead in brutal competition. And while we have a positive narrative that we want to say about law stuff generally, the most positive narrative is about my school. And if our admissions office is out telling the truth, its own truth, they're telling negative things about the competition. So we create for ourselves the ammunition that allows others to criticize us because we're in a great position to tell people all of our own dirty stories and air our dirty laundry for others. In any faculty, you can find 2 people, 1 person, 5 people that are going to be perfectly happy to tell a negative story about their own school. Third, our schools are not aligned with each other. We don't have a positive story that we can tell about individual schools at a lot of institutions right now because a lot of our colleagues don't really understand the dynamics that they're engaged in. Some of our colleagues are fighting a battle that used to be 5 years ago or 10 years ago called how do we make our scholarship go up? Others are fighting another battle which is how do we get status for clinicians? Others are fighting another battle that's about how do I get a salary increase? There is one battle to be fought, value for our students. Fourth, there are only 4 stories the newspaper tells, hero stories, but they are quickly followed by the hero has clay feet and is a goat. Sometime later, downstream, there's a story told about redemption. We're in the goat stage right now. We're not in the redemption stage, and it's going to take us a while to get redemption. Individual schools have control of their own destiny, and I just want to reinforce something you said. We have to take control of our own narrative. At the school level, how many heroes do we have who are our graduates? How many people do we know that but for their existence, the society would be a worse place? How many of our graduates add value every minute of the day, every time they step out of the door, every time they work with a client, an organization, and do something valuable? Those stories we own and control, and we have to tell them consistently. And then there's the enterprise. Is the ABA, the AALS, the NCBE, the NELP organization, Access Group, all of the major organizations of legal education, are they telling the story the same way? And the answer is no. We have the responsibility, all of us in legal education, to get our societies to know that this is a critical battle for the future of producing lawyers. Is our society better off without lawyers? No. Are we, as the model for the world of what a system of laws looks like, the envy of every other country? Yes. How are we going to make sure that the next generation and the generation after that have the same kind of representation, the same kind of public service, the same kind of give back that lawyers have been known for historically and will be known for into the future? That's what we're fighting for. And to me, that's what we have to begin to have as an enterprise story that's told with individual hero stories at all of our schools, with our own system aligned inside of our schools, getting up and giving up the idea of brutal competition with each other, because that's the only way that we can turn the narrative from being the goat to a redemption story.
Well, thank you. We've had some really interesting views here. What I would be interested in, maybe we could take this a little bit further, is how can we really kind of be able to insinuate the importance or the public good of legal education? Because a lot of folks, it starts from that premise. They don't see it as a public good in way, for instance, education was seen in the past. And also, if we're talking about development officers, if they're sitting in talking to a donor or someone else, they only got about 5 minutes to talk about this before eyes glass over or people are on to something else. So if you're having a conversation, what would you have a development officer say to kind of try to capsulize all the things we've just been talking about?
It's interesting, Greg, and pardon me, it's interesting, and I think that's a really very, very good question, because I'm sure everybody in the audience is trying to figure out, okay, how do we synthesize all of this so that we can create a narrative for our constituents that really is going to excite them. And I think there's a piece of everything that's been said so far that sort of fits into that. In my view, and I've seen this with regard to looking at stakeholders in schools, they love to hear narratives about how students are being motivated to do things in society. And so that narrative is always a very good one. I mean, in terms of what the institution does in order to instill that in students. And the good news on that, and I don't know if many of you have seen the data about this, but if you look at millennials, one of the things that seems to be a common thread is that they are very much motivated about really societal issues and how they can make society better. That, together with the fact that law schools have been more compelled to do more to provide opportunities for these students to do this, really have created some very good narratives out there in terms of what those schools can do. I also agree with one of the things that Rick and I think Paulette brought up that I think is very, very helpful, and that is creating a narrative about a graduate and what they've done. And this is one of the things that I've talked about in terms of the holistic nature of lawyers in society. And we've kind of lost this. Historically speaking, lawyers were considered to be very good at what they did and were very good citizens of society if they gave back to their communities. And there are all kinds of stories out there about individuals in all of our schools who have done a number of amazing things, either in their local communities or in their states or nationally, but those stories are never told with any degree of regularity or any kind of emphasis. And I think that is a very good attention grabber for anybody that you have, both that story and the story about how your students are making an impact.
I agree with that. Oh, which, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, thank you. I think that one of the things is that we can't wait until the point of going out to talk to donors to ask for money. The story has to be consistently told all along. So I can just give an example without being competitive, Rick. And it's something that I think that that all law schools to do, to your point, is to constantly talk about the heroes in the law school environment and the type of lawyers you are producing, and you give examples on a regular basis rather than waiting for the annual giving time to say this is what we've done and the achievements. And I think that when you do that, I know that for me it helps me to give back to my school, because I have to tell you, my school is actually a better school now than the one I went to. And so, and when I get things that Seton Hall, and I didn't know this at the time. I didn't know this at the time that I was going to school, but Seton Hall consistently, if you look at the data of who the federal judges are in New Jersey, and one of the good things that the dean did recently is that everyone was talking about the low bar passage rate. An announcement went out to the entire law school community right after the bar results talking about Seton Hall's very, very high passage rate. And so I think that communication cannot be isolated. I think we have to tell those hero stories on a regular and consistent basis, and to help alumni understand the value, the continuing value of their law degree, because it doesn't stop once they get the law degree, and how they have been able to achieve what they have as a result of their law degree, even if they are not in the highest and most lofty positions making $1 gazillion a year, because most lawyers are not. There is still a great deal more value from a law degree that you can get from most other degrees.
True.
And I think that when we point those things out, and the successes of the students, especially some students who have been, who are on the margins, who you took a chance with, and how they've been able to succeed. You know, as I've traveled around, I've heard incredible stories about students, and I think that if we highlight those, even if they don't appear to be the huge heroes, but when you have a law student, for example, whose mother is constantly telling her she is a fraud, that she does not belong in law school, and yet she graduates at the top of her class. We need to tell those stories to our alumni, because there's apparently something that has happened in the academy that caused her to believe that she could succeed. And so the law school is doing something wonderful for her, and it should make you, as a law graduate, as an alum, to contribute back to that school. Sorry for yelling.
So development ends up being more than one project. We've got this project called bringing the participation rate up. That's a hard thing to do in the best of times. That's the one the general messages tend to have some effect on. I want to put it off to the side and focus on our best prospects. Best prospects are almost always about what's in it for them. And what's in it for them starts with, if you hadn't had this education, would you be where you are today? Okay, so I always start with but for your education, what would your life have looked like? It takes you next to the question that education is not a means to an end, it is an end in itself, and education is good. It is good for the soul, it's good for the person, it's good for society, and we want more education, not less education. I did, however, once have a donor that said, I hate lawyers. He was a lawyer himself. I think the world would be better off without them. I said, for every, at the time, $1 million you give me, I'll take one less law student. Anything they can do to help, okay? We want to be helpful. Third thing I think that's out there is, yes, law is a means to an end. And if we do that, you think about the virtuous circle. What's in it for me? It's good for society and individuals. It is a means to an end. Oh, I'm back to me again. We have an ability at the donor level to make the narrative compelling because that individual understood exactly what education had meant to them. The more complicated question is what we do to make it true for everybody. Sure. And I think, as all of our colleagues, everyone on the panel has been suggesting, it starts by consistently upbeat messaging about the value of education, not for individual people, but for every person that comes through our institution, because essentially education is the only means in our society to move from point A to point D, not from point A to point A plus. We have to make it clear that without education, our society goes down the tubes. Because as members of the higher education, as members of the academy, we are in a noble profession doing something that is valuable. And that value is something that we have to convey every minute of our day, of our lives as we move forward, because none of us would be where we are without our education, and certainly none of our graduates would be where they are. There are some tough stories along the way, and we have to deal with those in a truthful and honest way. And I know as we go forward, Greg is going to force us to have to confront those realities.
Thank you, Rick. Actually, it does bring a question to mind. In my role as university president, I had to kind of be a referee among deans. And so the question that I would really kind of throw out is, how do you make those compelling arguments in the context of a university? You know, I mean, for instance, what you're doing and turning out, is that more important than what's happening in science or engineering or medicine or some other areas? I mean, how you know, resources are limited, or how do you tell a donor who might be supporting a science program, say, hey, you know, let's try to get some more law students here. How do you deal with those issues?
If I can address that to a sort of general extent, and I'll add an additional gloss to it, it's never it's almost a truism that people have more of an affinity for their undergraduate institutions than they do for their law schools. And that's one of the things that I'm sure many of the individuals who are out there with advancement have faced. Even if you're at a school where you have an undergraduate and a law school, and you have dual degree people, oftentimes their allegiance goes to the undergraduate program. And so having faced that at 2 law schools, one of the things that I oftentimes will do is 2 things. And number one, this is going to borrow from a thing that Rick said, and also that Paulette gave in much more detail. And that is, if you point out the utility of this degree beyond just the undergraduate degree. So this goes into the critique of undergraduate value as well, because that's been in the news quite a bit, that liberal arts and all of those things don't really lead to anything in terms of people making sort of sizable incomes and so forth and so on. And I think that's very misleading. We can have a different discussion on that. But if you look at the law degree with the undergraduate degree, it gives individuals tools to do many different things in their lives and for society as well. And that takes us back to really honing in on those narratives. Let me also say this. You are not in this alone. And I have often said that those narratives have to be done in tandem with the dean, with faculty, and with students. So, in a very effective way of doing this, you introduce it. If I were a development director on my own with a donor, in addition to making the initial argument, is to give a teaser to say, we need to continue this discussion so I can bring into you examples of why this has happened and how effective it is. And I will tell you something, I have never had a graduate of my law school who has not been impressed by a student narrative, meeting a student who has been involved in these programs and have made impacts, who tell them, this has made a difference in my life.
I am not in the academy, and so I have not been faced with trying to go to an overall administration and say that my law school should get money rather than the science, the engineering school, or the business school, or the fine arts school, or any of those. But what I do know is that, you know, we need all of those programs, and we can't advance any of those programs if we don't have lawyers. And so that the scientists cannot get a patent if they don't have a lawyer. The social worker cannot do her job if she is not adequately represented in court by a lawyer. And everything in our lives are touched by lawyers. And so, and so while we need all of these other disciplines to create a balanced society, the lawyer is the umbrella over all of those disciplines.
Great. Very good. Great.
We're not engaged in a zero-sum game. Law professors who become deans frequently become deans with the assumption that their job is to extract as much as they can from the university, keep as much as they've generated for themselves, let their colleagues do exactly what they want to do, and build a fortress around the law school. In some campuses, it's called the law school and the people across the river, or in some other location. Okay? Well, when we were rich, that was a really good strategy. Not such a good strategy when we become poor, and our university citizenship has become increasingly important. And not just for the law school, it's true at almost all the professional schools at this point, and it's also true in the liberal arts. We have allies across the university, and our job is to maximize the potential of every one of our graduates. And if that means they don't become a lawyer and they do something else within the university, that's the right choice. If we have a donor, and that donor has a deep affinity for some other part of the university, we should be helpful in getting that donor to that place, because we're going to pick up something along the way. And maximizing the potential of every person that we have, whether it's a donor, a faculty member, or a student, necessitates something that's a rare thing we call collaboration. It's another rare thing we call cooperation. And it's a shocking thing to me that that's not the instinct that we would have, that our first instinct is protective and selfish. And there are occasions when that's the right thing to do, when some predatory co-dean or co-development officer is latching onto the person we've been cultivating for the last 5 years. Our first object is to slap them down. Our better angels might tell us that we want to have a little thinking about what the best strategy will be, either for that donor or for the way we approach our provost and president. Because at the end of the day, we all are going to be up and sometimes and down in other parts, but we're part of one enterprise in higher education, and we're part of one enterprise in terms of helping the lives of our students achieve what their dreams are. And that, to me, is about figuring out the right thing to do for every one of the kids that we are working with and every one of our colleagues as we work our way through.
That's really great. Can I chime in on something you
Sure.
said there? I mean, one of the things that's often difficult, and I've said this in terms of looking at the dichotomy of schools where you have an undergraduate, a person who's graduated from the undergraduate school and the law school, and there's always this tussle with who gets this person. And I think one of the things that can be very instrumental, and I'm glad you said this, Rick, is trying to strategize in a very, very strategic way of how both of us could excite this individual. And if you do that, you could really maximize gains out of this individual by doing that kind of strategy. If you're butting heads, then you could either completely lose, or everybody could completely lose on that. And I think that's got to be a strategy. Now, I'll recognize this, and I'm in a capital campaign. And when I'm in a capital campaign, you know, I got to raise $160 billion. And I've got my development people say, you know, we got to raise $160 billion. We cannot lose our people. Don't let them talk to our people. We can't. And I understand that, and I understand the pressures that are there. But we need to talk with those donors very, very carefully, see what their interests are, and also figure out a way, and I love the way Paulette says this, because law is ubiquitous. You know, there's not a single discipline that it doesn't touch. Is there a way that we can, in some way, say, we can excite you in tandem with your original interests? And I think if we are able to do that, we can make some.
Well, it's really interesting that you talk about the strategy, and particularly fundraising strategy in tandem with other parts of the university. But I would have to say that I've been in a position on a number of occasions where I've been the referee to try to tell people, no, stop, you can't do that. You know, don't poach that candidate. I've played all the roles there, so has been kind of interesting. But the discussion about strategy also is very interesting to me as well, and I think might be particularly important to this group. How do you get development officers involved in the policy-making decisions that determine your strategy? They are not in the faculty. You know, they're not people you're talking to necessarily on a regular basis, although you obviously talk to them a lot, but they're not sculpting the message. How can they help sculpt the messages out there? Because they are, in many cases, the people that are most directly dealing with the donors, and they know what the first questions are going to be that are coming in there, and so they need they might have something to say in terms of the message that we're sculpting out there.
I'm going to use a phrase that now has become almost a cliche. It takes a village to craft the message. I mean, I think very, very often, certainly the dean is going to be sort of the focal point in terms of really crafting what will be the overall arching message. But I think it can be done more effectively in tandem with other stakeholders who are basically working in order to maximize your gains. And so I would very much encourage development officers sit down with their deans and also think about other individuals who could be helpful in adding to that message. So you have faculty who are doing very interesting things. And oftentimes, a lot of your stakeholders, the individuals who are graduates of schools, like to talk to faculty members and see what they're doing. Maybe not every single faculty member who's in your thing, but certainly a number of them. And the other one is to craft a strategy that's multifaceted. And what I mean by that, you're going to have an individual message that basically sort of frames the narrative about how you're going to attract people who want to invest in your enterprise. But then once you have that overall message, you want to figure out what's the most effective way of really reinforcing that. And as I've said before, having that message articulated in such a way as that you can bring in student examples, students who have been benefited by various programs which might excite this particular donor could be very good. You have faculty members who have either been originators of those programs, who have been advisors in those programs, who can talk to about that. That kind of teamwork can be very effective and really exciting.
I'm thinking, this is a little bit out of my element. But, you know, I just think that from a practical standpoint, nothing can be done in isolation. And that you can't look at a single issue and expect to come up with long-term and sustained resolutions to issues. And I think that sometimes we look at one thing as a singular problem or issue and try to go about to resolve it without talking to other people, other stakeholders who may be affected. You know, I think that the listening part is extremely well-founded. I don't think that we should suppose that we know what donors are really looking for without the donors sort of telling us in a way. So I think that it may be helpful to be more probing, to find out what it is that motivates donors, what it is that help them to give money, because everybody has a trigger point, I suppose. But it can't be in isolation. You have to look at a number of different factors and a number of different people, a number of different disciplines to find out how it is to best get money from individuals. I confess, I have not been in a position where if I've had to raise money for a educational institution, I've had to raise money for other things, and it becomes very personal, and it's like man to man or woman to woman combat relationships. It's about building relationships and building them long before you have to ask for money.
So it's sometimes said that lawyers think they know everything about everything. Okay, so we don't know very much about how to communicate well. And if the dean is the primary message maker in a school, it's probably an incompetent person doing incompetent things for bad reasons, but thinking they got it right. I was a dean for 20 years, so I can say that with some confidence. Why do we want to communicate? Who do we want to communicate to? What do we want to communicate? And how are we going to communicate? Every communications professional, because I've now worked with a whole bunch of them, wants you to have answers to those questions. That can't be done in sitting in the dean's suite or sitting, frankly, in the communications office. It's got to be done by having a deep understanding of who it is that you're communicating to and what the issues are that are important to them, and crafting authentic messages that speak the truth about your institution in a way that will be compelling. I think that this notion that we can do that without bringing our development office into the suite of decision makers is silly. It's also silly to think that we can do it without having professional help. And we all know what we can afford at our institutional level. If it's $50, then let's get the best $50 expert we can get. If it's $150,000, that gets us something more. And if it's $1 million, it gets us something else more than that. And it's making sure that those people are controlled, because they don't know what the hell they're doing. They don't know your constituency. You got to educate them, but they will help you to make that message work. And in my experience over a long time now in higher education, I rely so deeply upon my development office, my alumni relations office, communications officers, not because they have a pipeline to the truth, but because they have a set of expertises I don't have. And they're in a position to help me to understand when I say something that's just god-awful stupid, or in a way that will make people, get crazy. And I do that all the time. That's my job, is to say what I'm thinking. That's a bad idea. I'm thinking stupid stuff all the time. And so I got to have someone in there that gives me this filter, right? And puts it in front of me and says, don't be stupid. Okay? And, development officers are great at that because they understand, because they spend hours and hours and hours every week on the road hearing from people who will tell them the truth, even if they won't tell the truth to other folks. And it's our job inside the institution, if we have leadership that are sensitive to that, to take advantage of that leadership and insinuate ourselves into all those discussions. And if we don't, it's finding a way to get a crack in there to get yourself into that conversation, because you're going to bring something that is not held by others within the institution.
I just have probably a very naive question to ask. Is when the development officers go out to talk to people who have graduated from the law school, do they make certain assumptions about what the person may know? I think that one of the things is that I think that they should go with the presumption that the graduate knows nothing about what's going on at the law school, and start off by asking them, what do you know about what's going on at the law school right now? Or, what do you know about any of our recent graduates? I think we should start by asking them questions to find out what their basic level of understanding is of the law school and of the people who are being graduated. And it's true, I don't know how you can do anything without those people. I really don't, because those are the people who come to me, for example, and they always say that we're not coming to ask you for money, and that means right now. But you still get a better sense, and the graduate is more willing to be more open and letting you know what's going on, even if you know they're coming back to ask for money.
Well, I think go ahead, Blake, you want to say something?
No. I was just going to say it sort of goes back to that village thing, right? So this idea that you've got your people who are advancement people who are out on the road talking to those individuals. And I think Paulette is right. I think many of the stakeholders, particularly major stakeholders, people who can really give you major dollars, many of them haven't been to the law school. Right. So they don't know a lot about it. So you want to get them educated on it. And that brings up another point of trying to bring them into the building and inviting them in so that they can talk to some of the people who've helped craft this message. I also want to comment on something that Rick said a little bit earlier in terms of really addressing individuals who are reticent about giving to law school because they hate lawyers. And I've confronted this to a large extent, and I'm sure there's not a development person out there that, and particularly when these people are lawyers themselves, and they go out there and they say they hate lawyers. The one thing that confounds me about that is that we are one of the few professions that has been defined by the worst in it. I mean, if you think about this, I've had a bad dentist. I've had a bad doctor. But nobody says all doctors are bad or all dentists are bad. For some reason, we've been defined this way. And so when I've confronted that, I always circle back to the positive. I mean, the lawyers who have made differences in the lives of others. And when I've been involved in that conversation, I make it personal. And this is one of the things, and I love, Rick, the way you say, we're not experts at everything. You need to talk to a person who is very good at really helping you craft the message. And as I began my presidency of AALS, I talked with a public relations person. And they said, Dean, you have a great personality, everything like that, but a strategy you should use to really capture people is to give a personal narrative. And so when I've been confronted by the individual who said, Dean, I hate lawyers, I just got off the phone on a deposition with one, and that has intensified my view. And then I will say, I'll never forget when I was 8 years old and I was a Boy Scout, and the person who gave up their own time, and this is a private practitioner, gave up his own time, even though he was struggling to make a living. He advised my particular troop, invited us to his office. It was the first time in my life I had ever seen a professional, and that was a lawyer. And it wasn't that he was indoctrinating me to be a lawyer, but he had impressed me so much. There are so many of those narratives out there. And if you as advancement people can get with your deans, get with your faculty, get with students, to figure out what those narratives are, you can rebut those.
I don't
Well, we
like
raised a
the
lot of
word-
important issues here, but I would like to kind of circle back to where we started and hone down on something pretty specific. We've talked about the heroes, we've talked about the narrative, but there's a lot of things that are happening in law school these days in terms of innovation, new programs, that type of thing, and not only in law schools, but in the legal profession. And so I guess if you had to, say, give your 5-minute elevator speech, what would you say about what's the most important innovation that's happening in law school and legal education and the profession these days that oftentimes people just don't know about?
Well, I'll start, but I'm going to pass it to Rick because he's seen it from a variety of different perspectives, and I'm sure Paulette has seen it in terms of her practice. One of the things that, I don't know, Rick, if you didn't say it in this panel, I think I've heard you say this before, you can't let a good crisis go to waste. And I'm trying to remember where that came from. So what does that mean, right? So here we have this downturn and all this kind of stuff. The one thing that I have noticed is that there's not a single law school on the planet that's not trying to figure out how do we make ourselves more relevant in this very challenging environment. And one of the things that's come out of that is the wealth of programming that basically we're giving our students in order to really show them the synergies between what happens in the classroom and the real world. And a lot of that has to do with a lot of experiential education and the proliferation of pro bono, and Paulette, you talked about this, the proliferation of pro bono activity that is happening at law schools all across the country. I dare say if you were to do a comparative data search on now versus 10 years ago, there are far many more hours of pro bono service that are being given by law students all over the country than there ever have been before. That is something that I think can positively resonate with folks, and I'll let the rest of them sort of talk about it.
I think that pro bono, and I'm a big proponent of pro bono. Right, thank you. I'm a big proponent of pro bono also, and as someone who has recruited law students to our firm, it's not just as law students, but they ask 2 questions. They want to know how much pro bono your law firm does, and do you get credit for doing pro bono work, and what are your diversity and inclusion efforts, and not what's just on your website. And so, young people want to know about that because they believe that it brings a lot of value to the profession. And I think that one of the innovative things that law schools are doing is that because they care about the justice gap and they care about providing services for low-income people. And so there's some law schools now, which I find very exciting, is the ones that are creating these incubators so that they're training lawyers, they're training law students to who don't want to work for large firms, and by the way, they have never been the biggest employers of law students. They've never been the biggest employers of law students, but those who want to have solo practices or small practices and represent low-income people, individuals, and still be able to make a decent living so that they can pay back their law school loans. And you have a proliferation of that. One is the University of Maryland has such a program, and I think that that's where the collaboration comes in among legal professionals, the law schools, bar associations, and so the Maryland State Bar Association is a big part of in terms of providing funding for the incubator program, but it is to the benefit of law firms and other groups to help to participate and to contribute to that type of innovation. I think that a lot of young people are understanding that they can provide a fair, enjoy a fair living, and also provide services to people who are not eligible for legal services and who can't afford people like me. I can't afford myself. And so I think that those type of programs, and also having people develop more skills, more practical skills in the law school environment to help them once they are graduates from law school are very helpful.
This is really a hard question because innovation is a double-edged sword. You can say, what are others doing? And that may be where all the innovation is taking place. What are we doing? Not so much. Okay, so we have to understand what the truth is about our own institution as we begin to tell a story about innovation. There are three consistent themes of criticism of law school. It costs too much, it's not very good, and we treat our students like crap. Okay, those stories are the ones that get told all the time. So I guess I would start with, what are we doing about those three things within our own school? What are we doing to increase the quality of the experience every student has within our institution? Do we treat them well? Are they given the kind of advice they need to make their lives meaningful when they graduate? So innovation there is largely about turning our attention from the things that we used to care the most about, which were big scholarship, huge, research agendas, placement at the top law firms, whatever it might have been in our school, and asking a very granular, student-by-student story about how is their experience getting better at our school. Second, the quality experience is, I think, what we were just speaking to. Pro bono is a quality experience. Greater clinical education is a better experience. More, classroom novelty, new subject areas, and you can have a really interesting conversation about whether any of that stuff matters, right? I mean, because when you talk to our graduates, they say the most important thing was the first year, and I learned how to think critically. And it's just an extension of all the other critical thinking I learned when I was an undergraduate student that you were going to talk about earlier, Blake. So it could be that all this innovation is largely chairs on the Titanic being moved around, and so I want to worry a little bit. Cost. What are we really doing about cost? Because that's at the top of everyone's mind. Law school looks the same as it used to look, times 3.5% compounding annually. That's what our tuition looks like, at least at rack rate. Now, the truth is, we know that our discount rate has gone up at a faster rate than our tuition rate, so we could tell a story about, well, we're giving away more free stuff to our students. But fundamentally, what that really means is that we charge a lot and we give back a lot, because if we don't, we won't get students. It doesn't quite answer the question what it actually costs to deliver education. Innovation in the next 5-year period is going to take place in two places, or next 7 years, next 20 years, depends on what the school is going to look like. But essentially, there's really only two ways of getting at the cost issue. We've got to accelerate time through higher education generally. Law school's the last 3 years of a broken 7-year horizon. Costs a lot to be an undergraduate. Costs lots to be an undergraduate. And you can't get government funding with the kind of loan forgiveness you like to get that you can get on the law school side. Ugly 4 years, then ugly 3 years, 7 years. It takes a long time to grow up in America. So what can we do to accelerate that? Are there ways of making 3+3 programs, 2+3 programs? Programs where we get high school acceleration first, where kids come into school with a greater advanced placement, not based on an exam, but based upon the performance of actual academic higher education work at your school before they ever set foot as an undergraduate. That's one question. Second question is, when are we going to wake up and know that online education is necessary, critical, and it's going to happen across the law schools as it has in other parts of the academy? And then we got to figure out which parts should be online, which parts are in person, how we lower the residency, how we give students greater chances to be out doing externships and taking for-pay work while they're in school, something that we have been reticent about. Real innovation is going to take place as we get further down to the bottom of the crisis. And I would say that that's a narrative that has to be told at your school. You got to confront the cost issue, it's got to be addressed, and it's got to be a real plan that's about something other than increasing scholarships for the best students, because that's the way we tend to discount. You're a good student, well, here's more money. Here's 100%. No, 120%. We'll get your living costs covered. Okay? That is not lowering the cost of education. Help. Well, thank God, we got her at the school. What are we doing about Joe student, Joe student, Susie student? The only way we're getting at those is we start thinking in an aggregate term about how we lower the cost of education in our part of that horizon.
Thank you.